Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another video here on Buckeye Mike. I'm your host, Buckeye Mike. Joining me today is the wonderful, awesome Spencer McLaughlin from Locked On Ducks and Locked On Pac-12. How are we doing today?
We're doing pretty well. It's McLaughlin, but don't sweat it. You're not the first to make that.
McLaughlin. Oh, boy.
Not the first to make that mistake. And believe me, something like that doesn't throw me off my game.
Shoot. All right, so let's see. I want to briefly discuss 2022 for Oregon. Oregon finished 9-3.
10-3 with the bowl game.
Yeah, 10-3 with the bowl game. 7-2 in the Pac-12. Incredibly amazing Holiday Bowl victory over North Carolina that, I'll be honest, I wasn't completely sure you guys would pick up.
There were plenty of moments in that game where I wasn't sure we were going to pick up that victory. I'm definitely glad we did, though. I like the symbolism of stringing together 10-win seasons is a non-zero factor in continuing to kind of build the program and continue building momentum and such. And it also just feels better to end that season with a win rather than a loss.
Agreed. Let's see. It was Dan Lanning's first year as head coach. So overall, I would assume, in my opinion, that comes across as a really good first season. I mean, most first-season head coaches or first-year head coaches finish like 6-6, 7-6, 6-7.
I mean, it depends on what sort of situation you're taking over, but I mean, it was a good first year for Dan Lanning. I would not describe it as great. There were two collapses against our biggest rivals that are still leaving a sour taste in our mouths right now that we are looking forward to getting rid of heading into the season. But I think by all accounts it was a good start. It was a good season. It was probably about average for where the talent has been at Oregon the last couple of years, where the expectation are, where the program's at, and just kind of what we've seen from the Ducks and what they're capable of the last several years. I do think although the records were almost identical, 10-4 in 2021, 10-3 a season ago, I think Oregon was a better football team in 2022, and I think that combined with certain other factors that I think were encouraging and were steps forward from the previous year were, a good first year for Lanning and company. But I think there's definitely still room to grow, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. They were outside of the top 100 in college football in defending the pass a year ago, which is definitely not what you expect when you hire Georgia's defensive coordinator, who won a national championship there. But he was dealing with a lot of players that were not quote unquote his guys. Doesn't mean they weren't talented, but they might not have been the perfect scheme fit for what they were doing or what they want to do. But now that he's had a full offseason, there are very few holdovers from the previous coaching administration. I mean, very, very few on both sides of the ball. So I think overall there's a reasonable expectation that Oregon is better, or at least an aspiration that Oregon will be even better in 2023. But fundamentally, it was a good first year for Lanning, a great place to start. He's recruiting very, very well, he and his staff. But there is a lot to build on the field and improve upon in 2023 this season as well.
Absolutely. Makes complete sense to me. How would you say the transition for Bo Nix went as far as transitioning from Auburn to Oregon? And that super sour taste that was left in your mouth by the back-to-back champions at the first part of the season?
Well, I mean, honestly, the Georgia game was painful. Not as painful as losing to Oregon State and Washington in a 3-week span in the fashion in which we did. You had both games if you looked at the ESPN like win probability chart at various points in both games, Oregon's win probability was well over 90%, and they ended up losing both of those games. And, the Georgia game, I didn't think we had a chance to win. I was just hoping to keep it close. That didn't happen, and it shouldn't have been as bad as it was, but it just frankly looked like a team that hadn't quite put it together, didn't have a tune-up game and needed it. Dan Lanning didn't have as much talent as Kirby Smart. What Kirby Smart said was accurate. He basically said Lanning will never admit this, but they don't have as much talent over there as we do over here. And that definitely showed on the field on both sides of the ball in various areas. Now, Oregon's offensive line actually held up really, really well in that game, but their defense was overmatched, and Bo Nix was not a new player for Kirby Smart to go up against a game plan, and he did a really, really good job of exposing Bo for what he'd had a tendency to do while he was at Auburn. But then after that, I mean, it was more than smooth sailing. It was a seamless adjustment for Bo Nix and the rest of the team, because they started to trust Bo. They had a game against Eastern Washington the following week, and then the following week against BYU, who was ranked 12th at the time. They'd won their first couple of games. They were feeling good. Oregon just trounced them. I mean, at one point the score was 38-7, and that was really a turning point. And Bo was playing really well. He ended up setting the Oregon single season completion percentage record, and that was kind of the statement game that made you realize, okay, this is not the team that got blown out horribly against Georgia. This is going to be a different kind of season. They can win the Pac-12. They can beat good teams, and they did, right? All season long, we saw that be the case, and they had the late season stumbles, but I think what gets overlooked, because it's not a rival the way Oregon State and Washington are, is in 2021, Oregon played Utah twice and lost those two games by a combined score of 76-17. Like, it was horrific. Like, it was absolutely, positively awful from that Mario Cristobal-led team. Turn the page over to 2022, and Oregon beats Utah 20-17 with a hobbled Bo Nix, who we didn't even think was going to play because he was so injured. He'd gotten hurt in the Washington game the week prior, and the defense had their best week of the year and such. So there were a lot of really, really good things, and Bo was really good, and we've got high hopes for him this year. He put himself in the Heisman race a year ago. No reason he can't be kind of back in that fold this season if he plays to his potential. But I think what we saw from him a year ago is the player that people thought we were getting when Bo Nix came out of high school, but it turns out he just didn't have the right support system at Auburn. But he had that at Oregon a year ago, and he should have that once again. I don't think the offensive line will be quite as dominant as they were in 2022, but they should still be good, and he's got a great assortment of weapons around him. A new offensive coordinator, which is definitely going to be a bit of a test for everybody, but I think overall he's set up for success once again.
I know this is just kind of random, but I do vaguely remember watching the Washington game. I think it was the Washington game, and Bo Nix was hurt or something. It came down to like the last play. Oregon had the ball and threw a Hail Mary, and it was one of those like, okay, why didn't it go like 50 yards? It only went like 20 yards or something.
Yeah, it came up short on the final Hail Mary. It looked like he'd completed a pass on the previous play to Troy Franklin to maybe put us into field goal range to tie the game, and it probably should have been ruled that way. But that's not why Oregon lost the game. That's a 50-50 call. Pac-12 officials, you can't bank on them and whatnot. But I think that was indicative of kind of what we saw the rest of the season, which is Bo was never the same mobile version of himself we saw over the first 9-10 weeks of the year. And it did limit the offense because not really quarterback runs, but quarterback mobility was a big part of what Oregon did offensively, and Bo extending plays with his legs and scrambling for first downs on third and all that sort of stuff. I think he lost that, and then the offense definitely struggled a bit as a result. He looked a lot healthier in the Oregon State game, and the offense up until the final goal line sequence was really, really good all game long against a really good Oregon State defense. So I think that that's something we definitely need to have is Bo Nix staying healthy, because we saw what happens when that element is removed from his game. And it's not that he isn't a capable pocket passer, but it adds another explosive element to the offense and another kind of dynamic component when you're able to have Bo Nix using his legs. It makes him the best version of himself, and hopefully that's what we get again this season.
Um, last thing before we dive into the schedule, um, what kind of impact has Dan Lanning had on the recruiting so far?
It's been amazing. I mean, it is really, really good. It's a top 10 2024 class right now. They just had a decommitment. They did sign another four-star guy to replace Tyseer Denmark, who flipped to Penn State, or it looks like he's going to anyway. But so far, the recruiting is really good. You know, I talk to recruiting people in the industry, and they all say the same thing. Like, you can recruit really well at Oregon. They have money, they have NIL, they have a big brand, they have a good program, and all that sort of stuff. But you have to be a grinder. You have to be willing to put in the work. And Mario Cristobal was that, and Dan Lanning is clearly that as well, because he, signed in top 10 class, high school and portal in 2022. Or in the 2023 cycle, rather. 2024 is looking like it'll be in that same sort of ballpark. And the 2024 class, which has already got a couple quarterbacks and a variety of skill position players and offensive linemen, it's really, really balanced right now. They are going to be pushing for the best class in program history in terms of overall composite rating on 24/7 Sports, and highest ranking, which is currently sixth with the 2021 class. So I think that that's been in a really, really good place. The tone is kind of set on that front from the moment he got to Oregon's campus, and really sunk his teeth in on the recruiting trail. And his first big recruiting victory was Josh Connerly, who's going to be our starting left tackle this year, and that was back in 2022 when he hadn't even coached a game yet. So I think the recruiting results couldn't be a whole heck of a lot better right now. And I think that that's where you have to be if you're Oregon. If you want to get back to the playoff, win a national championship one day, we know you have to recruit at a high level, and it's pretty clear that Lanning and the staff that he's put together are more than capable of doing just that.
So how confident are you in the Bo Nix replacements?
The Bo Nix replacement, like the future of the quarterback position?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Anybody's guess, honestly. Like, that's gonna be a big, probably the biggest offseason topic for Oregon after this year is what do you do after Bo Nix? Because Ty Thompson has not looked like he's that kind of guy to be a starting quarterback. He was supposed to be coming out of high school, but I mean, in the limited action we've seen him, and now across two coaching staffs, this has been the case. By the way, I look like a ghost because the sun is just coming through the window that's right in front of me. But the action that we have seen from Ty Thompson, neither coaching staff has trusted him. Neither coaching staff has made him the starter. Neither coaching staff has, given him real opportunities to throw the ball down the field in games in a significant way. And he just has shown the same sorts of mistakes and drawbacks that he showed when he was a freshman, which is he doesn't process things correctly, and he gets robotic. He stares on his reads, and he's just not able to execute and orchestrate an offense at the level that you need to win games in the way in which Oregon would like to. So it's not that he doesn't have the physical talent to. He's 6'5". He's pretty mobile, and he's got a huge, huge, special, dynamic arm. But it's the between the ears stuff, the processing, the trusting your reads, the being able to make underneath shorter throws, all that sort of stuff is what's missing for him. And it's not that he can't make that step, but he hasn't yet. But as of now, going into next offseason, Oregon will have 4 quarterbacks on the roster. Now, whether or not it's those 4 heading into fall of 2024, anybody's guess with the portal nowadays. But you've got Ty Thompson. Austin Novosad, the quarterback they signed in the 2023 class, will have had a year under his belt in an offseason. He needs to bulk up a little bit. I do like his upside, though. I think he can be a really solid starter. And then they've signed 2 quarterbacks in the 2024 cycle, 3-star Luke Moga, who's a really good athlete, and 4-star Michael Van Buren, who's also a pretty good athlete, and both are capable throwers of the football as well. But banking on true freshmen, probably not your best option there. So I could definitely see Thompson or Novosad being a starter. I doubt either of the true freshmen start in 2024. I could also see them, encouraging somebody, maybe Ty or maybe one of the freshmen, I don't know, to, hit the portal and seek their options elsewhere. But because then they might want to bring somebody in. But that all depends on how Thompson and Novosad develop and pick things up during the course of the season and next offseason as well.
It sounds promising, but kind of like
Oh, it's a major question mark.
Yeah.
The roster in 2024 should be pretty stacked. Quarterback, don't know. Like we just don't know. And look, maybe they'll just end up going to the portal and grabbing somebody, plug and play guy. Could be, because that's college football now. But you recruited these guys for a reason. Now, they didn't recruit Ty Thompson, this staff, but they recruited Austin Novosad for a reason. They saw something in him. Whether or not he reaches that potential, there's only about 500 different factors that go into whether or not that happens.
I mean, I don't know. I feel like you're right to a point, and then some people, it's like, well, if you just pluck enough people out of the portal, you can win with a portal team. And I guess you could, but I mean, there's only so far I feel like you could really go if your team is basically a portal team.
That depends. That depends on the volume of kids you can add, because Colorado has added 51 transfers this offseason. Their preseason win total on FanDuel is still 3.5. But here's the other thing. We think of transfers in college football big picture as they're guys who come in, they help you for 1 year, right? Grad transfers. That's the traditional transfer. The guys who historically have been immediately eligible to play. And Oregon's had those. Everybody's had those.
Mm-hmm.
But you can bring kids in now who transfer to your program and then have 3 years of eligibility, right? Or 2 years of eligibility. So, the transfers that Oregon's brought in this year, Justin Jacobs, linebacker from Iowa, he's got 2 years of eligibility left. It's either 2 or 3. Gary Bryant Jr., wide receiver from USC, 2 years of eligibility left. Tez Johnson, wide receiver from Troy, 2 years of eligibility. You can kind of build that way. I don't know that you can build an entire team, but I mean, you can build most of it. And if you go portal heavy year after year after year, it's kind of like high school recruiting in that, some kids are going to be ready to play now. Some kids will be more ready to play or have a bigger role later. So I think that sort of stuff is still evolving. But I mean, you can't exclusively, right? You can't bring in 10 high school kids in a class. Like, that's just not enough bodies on your roster. You're not going to have enough scholarships. But you used to have to bring in, 25 to 30. That number can now be down to like 18 to 20 with how many kids you can bring in via the portal.
That makes sense. All right. So, as we look at the schedule here, I roughly think you can still hit 10 wins this year.
You can.
But I think you can do it before having to win a bowl game to get to 10.
Yeah, Vegas thinks so. Their preseason win total is 9.5, and I think that's about right for a team that should have been 10-2 a year ago. If they just had avoided one of those collapses against Washington and Oregon State. But I think when you look at the schedule, it's overall pretty manageable. Like, the only tough road game in conference, well, you got Washington and Utah, I suppose. So those are actually both pretty tough. I take that back. But I think overall it's a manageable schedule. When you go down the list and say, okay, that Texas Tech game is not going to be easy at all whatsoever. Portland State and Hawaii, those are wins. Colorado at home, that's going to be a win. At Stanford, should be a win. We lost to a crappy Stanford team in 2021. I don't think that happens again. As long as you beat Texas Tech, you should be 5-0 going into your bye before the Washington game. And then things, really get dicey. And I will never sleep on Washington State and Cal. I'm not that worried about Arizona State. Oregon State is a good team. Utah is a good team. Washington's a good team. USC is a really good team. Those are kind of the four conference games that will define Oregon's season. Now, the Texas Tech game will work to define it as well. But let's say you get the perfect start and you're 5-0, which probably going to end up being my prediction. But I mean, they'll be no worse than 4-1 for sure. I can't, barring an injury to Bo Nix, if everybody stays healthy, they should be 4-1 or 5-0, no problem. Let's say it's 5-0. You have Washington State, you have Cal at home, you have Oregon State at home. I think those three games are wins because they come at Autzen Stadium. So then that comes down to Washington, Utah, and USC, right? And I don't think Arizona State is ready to compete. If you go 2-1 of those games and everything else plays out the way it should, well, now you're looking at 11-1. Do I think this is an 11-1 football team? I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm an Oregon fan. I just try to not get, overly excited about that sort of stuff, and I don't want to set the bar too high in my own mind, or else I'll just set myself up for disappointment later. But when I look at the games you should win and the games they can win but are not guaranteed, between at Washington, at Utah, and USC at home, if you win two of those games, you're doing really damn well. But winning only one of them is pretty feasible, right? Because those could all be what I call Bob games, bounce of ball. I got that term from Josh Pate of the Late Kick Extra podcast, who I listen to all the time. He's awesome, but they are bounce of ball games. And that's what the Washington and Oregon State games were a year ago. So was the Washington State game for Oregon, by the way. Final score was 44-41. It was a crazy, crazy game up in Pullman. But those games, it's hard to predict. It's hard to know for sure because I think the lines have actually already been set for all those games, if I'm not mistaken. I believe Washington is favored by 1. Hold on, let me look. So Oregon is favored by 4 at Texas Tech. Washington is favored by 2.5 in Seattle. Utah is favored by 1 in Salt Lake City. Oregon's favored by 1 at home against USC. And the Oregon State line, I believe, is Oregon minus 7.5. So let's assume they can win the game. They're favored by 7.5 against the Beavs, and they're out for revenge. Let's say that happens. Not a given, but let's just say. When you have 3 games that are all under a field goal point spread, those are pick'ems. Those are essentially pick'ems. So I can't look at them and say, I could see us going 3-0 as likely as we are to go 0-3 in those games. You've got good teams. You've got 2 of them on the road. I think 2-1 is probably the best, most realistic scenario, but it's not like if you told me right now they go 1-2 of those games, I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility whatsoever.
What do you feel like they have to do to make the Pac championship game?
Be better against the pass. They allowed 260 passing yards a game last year. That cannot continue. That's got to get down under 230. They have to be better in the red zone with their touchdown efficiency. They had a couple games last year where they, really struggled down in the red zone, and that'll be up to new offensive coordinator Will Stein to, have some creative plays. I mean, mostly it was execution. They just kept false starting, and they were just really, really sloppy once they got down in the red zone. Hurt them in the Washington State game, which they should have won by more than they did if that hadn't happened. They didn't score a touchdown in the first half, but they marched the ball down the field every single time they had it, and then they got down there and they had 3 field goals and a pick six. Those were their 4 red zone drives in the first half in Pullman, and then they started scoring touchdowns, and they ended up with 44 points by the end of the game. One of them was a defensive touchdown, but I think to do that schedule wise, you got to beat at least 1, probably 2 of Washington, Utah, and USC, and beat Oregon State. Probably you're going to need to do that, but I think the other thing that can't go overlooked is you got to avoid a stumble. Like in 2021, they lost to a 3-9 Stanford team. Why? I don't know. College football. Washington lost to 3-9 Arizona State last year. Why? I don't know. College football. So I think that's another thing you have to look at here is the defense has to be better. The offense needs to match the production, but they have to avoid a stumble and perform well in those key games, and they're not going to be easy. Like this is not an easy schedule. It's not an impossible schedule,
Mhm.
and we're just gonna have to wait and see if Dan Lanning and the Ducks are really up to the task.
Um, Now I know this is mainly Oregon, but do you think, based on what we saw Utah do twice and Tulane, that between the three games there is a mixture of some kind of playbook out there that is capable of beating this USC team? Because honestly, I think they're not as good as last year, but at the same time, I have them making the playoff.
Yeah, I don't have. I'm not picking a Pac-12 team to make the playoff. We're going to cannibalize ourselves too hard. It's going to be standard operating procedure. Just run it back once again. Somebody will be right there, and then somebody else will knock them off. I think you just have too many good teams in here, and you don't have a truly great or a dominant team. Now, USC, Oregon, Washington, all teams that could do that. Maybe Utah or Oregon State could make a run in there, but I think they're all good to really good, but I don't see it great. And when you look at the Pac-12 teams that have made the playoff, right? You can only have one loss on your roster, or you have to be undefeated. Neither of the Pac-12 teams that have made it have been undefeated. So you figure you're going to have a one-loss team that would get in, which they can do, right? One-loss Power 5 champ, you have a really good chance of getting into a 4-team college football playoff. History shows that. So
Yeah.
you think back to those teams: Washington 2016, Oregon 2014. Are any of these teams as good? USC maybe, but man, that defense, that they did bolster their defensive line with a couple of guys, and they've got some key returners in the secondary, but they lost players from there. And I don't trust Alex Grinch. I just don't.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen it too many times. Like I've watched that Oklahoma team time and time again either get to the playoff and not be able to defend, or not get to the playoff because they can't defend. I know USC is going to score 1,000,000 points this season. I know that's going to happen.
It's
I
can they
don't.
keep pace with the other
Can
teams?
they just get a couple stops? And a year
Yeah.
ago, USC fans gave me we're G rated on this show, so I assume.
You're good.
Oh, well, anyway, USC fans gave me a lot of shit last year on my Pac-12 pod, because early in the season, their defense was basically performing in a way that was not sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
And they were causing turnovers at a rate that I tried to come on and say, like, look, it's great they're making these plays, but this is not sustainable. You do not force 3.5 to 4 turnovers on average a game. This is
Mm-hmm.
not normal. They have to be able to get actual, tangible, regular stops. And USC fans called me a hater. And then what happened? Utah only turned the ball over once in 2 games. And guess what? They kicked the crap out of them. Because you don't
Yeah.
have to have. Here's the thing. Oregon fans ask me, from time to time, like, hey, could we have a top 30 offense and a top 30 defense? I'm like, if we do that, we're going to the playoff, okay? What we are striving for here is a top 10 offense, and you don't need a top 10 defense. You don't need a top 20 defense to win the conference and then win, get to the college football playoff. You need like a top 30, 40 defense, right? You have to be good. You have to be above average, but you don't need to be dominant on both sides of the ball. You need to be dominant on one side of the ball and then good to really good on the other side of the ball. That's what a playoff team typically looks like. And when you go back, and I know this Oregon team obviously super well, the 2014 team was dominant on offense. They had the best player in the country, Marcus Mariota, best player in the history of the University of Oregon. They had a bunch of good weapons. They had a brilliant offensive system that was perfect. Like, they were a high-flying offense, and their defense was not dominant, but it was good. They had a good defense. It was littered with NFL guys. They had DeForest Buckner. They had Eric Armstead. They had Ifo Ekpreolumu, who would have been a first or second round NFL draft pick if he hadn't gotten hurt. They had Troy Hill, who's still in the NFL. They had Joe Walker, who had a nice little stint in the NFL. They had guys all over the place that could make an NFL roster on defense. And that's what you have to have. That's what you are looking for. And do I feel like any of these teams, Washington, USC, or Oregon, have the sort of balance to where, they're dominant on one side, offense for all three of them, but which defense is going to make the most plays? I don't know. Oregon's got the most composite talent on defense, but they had a lot of composite talent on their defense a year ago, and it kind of
Mhm.
stunk at times. It was not completely terrible. It was moderately improved from a year ago, but it was not as good as it should have been. They were one of the worst third down teams in the country. They're like 126th on third down a year ago, out of like 133 FBS, football programs. So those are the sorts of questions that we can't answer right now because that
Right.
sort of stuff you can talk about it and prognosticate about what's going to happen. Looks this way on paper and yada yada yada. You can't know until you see that stuff. Until you see has what Washington's added some transfers, USC's added transfers, Oregon's revamped their defense. Which unit is going to be able to perform the best against each other because they all play each other. Oregon plays Washington. Oregon plays USC. Washington plays Oregon, Washington plays USC, and Washington plays Utah, I believe, as well. And Oregon, of course, plays Utah and USC. You can see there, Utah and USC, both in the former Pac-12 South, they'll play each other too. So that's why I just feel that I'm not putting a Pac-12 team into the playoff this year because
Mhm.
which team is a couple steps above the others? I don't see it. I think they're all really good. I think any of them could win a New Year's Six bowl. I don't know that any of them can have this
Mm,
sort of season, barring a couple of major breaks,
mm.
either within their own games or from other matchups and such, or somebody gets hurt or whatever. I don't see them having the sort of season where they could go. I mean, like you have to be 12-1. That's what you need. And USC has got to play Oregon, has got to play Utah, who they haven't beaten yet with Lincoln Riley. They're 0-2. They have to play Washington. They have to play UCLA. I think they'll beat UCLA. They did a year ago, and UCLA doesn't have Dorian Thompson-Robinson anymore. They have to beat Notre Dame as well, because if you're talking about the playoff, right, USC can only have one loss, period. Not one conference loss. They can only have one loss, period. So Washington, Utah, UCLA, Notre Dame, and Oregon. Okay, those 5 games,
Mhm.
USC has to go perfect against everybody else. Okay, they're capable of doing that, right? And Oregon is capable of going perfect outside of the 5 games that I've talked about here. But everybody's gonna have 5 games in here, and
Mm.
someone has to go 4-1 in those 5 games, and that's just a really hard thing to do.
I mean, shifting it back to Oregon, there's one of two ways that Oregon could make the playoff, in my opinion. You either come into Washington at 5-0 and you lose Washington close and you win out, or you come into USC at what 8-0, I think it would be
6, 7, 8. They'd be 9-0.
9-0. You come into USC at 9-0, and you gotta lose close because if you let USC trample you, you're kind of getting a rehash of 2018 Ohio State. They got trampled by Purdue. That was their only loss for the year. Committee said no because you lost by way too much.
So I'd say the most likely playoff path, looking at the schedule here,
Mm-hmm.
is you start 5-0. You have the bye. You beat Washington, beat Wazoo at home, lose to Utah
Mm-hmm.
because Washington's not going to be an easy place to play. But if you're talking about where Oregon's had more success historically and where I think it's a tougher place to play, the answer is they've had more success at Washington and Seattle, and I think it's a less tough environment than Salt Lake City. Doesn't mean it's easy, not going to be, right? Washington's favored in the game, but I think that you're more likely to win at Washington than you are at Utah. So I think that the most likely playoff path for the Ducks
Mm-hmm.
is you go 5-0, you go 6-0, you go 7-0, you lose to Utah 7-1, you rebound against Cal at home, then you beat USC, you go win at ASU, hopefully trounce them there, come home, beat Oregon State, you're in the Pac-12 championship game, and then you're going to have to win. I think that's the most likely, not the only playoff path. I think that's the most likely one that gives them
Yeah.
enough quality wins, the appropriate record, and also would kind of allow them to, adjudicate momentum. Not that you determine when you have that and such, but carry momentum through the Washington game. Okay, you're not going undefeated. Got to lose one of those games in there somewhere. I would say Utah, but then, and I take that Utah game because it's the toughest road environment, but USC at home, I'll lean towards the Ducks to win games at Autzen Stadium because they tend to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, if they're going to do it, it's definitely a variation of the three. It's one of the three.
Yeah, and I mean, here, and I say that's the most likely because if you beat Washington and Utah, yeah, you could still lose to USC and be okay. But if you beat Washington and Utah and then you beat Cal and you're 9-0 going to the USC game and then you lose, 9-1 does still probably sit you inside the top 10.
Yeah.
But you have to get into the top 4. And then the question would be, Arizona State probably going to be under 500, so that game's not going to do anything for you. Oregon State, what are they going to do? Right? Now, they can be a good football team, Oregon State. But is that win, right, is that going to get you enough clout to move you up from 7 to 5 to where a win in the championship game against someone who would probably be a top 10, 15 opponent almost certainly would then bump you into the top 4 into the playoff? I don't know, because I think Oregon State can be good. Their program has done a slow and steady build under Jonathan Smith. They deserve a lot of credit. They, beat Oregon a season ago. They have done a really, really good job there. But they had not won 10 games as they did a year ago since 2006. They have never in their program's history had back-to-back 10-win seasons. That's never happened in the history of Oregon State football. So at that point in time, is Oregon State going to be an 8-3 team that's inside the top 20? Or could they take a step back and be, a 7-4 team that is probably not inside the top 25 and is a good win but not a great win? That's why I say the beating Washington and USC and losing to Utah is the most likely path for Oregon to get in.
Now, I mean, the one where I'm kind of like, okay, maybe US as long as it's like a 10-point loss, because that's the issue with the other teams going against USC is, okay, they lose, but they lose in blowout fashion a lot of times.
Who, USC?
The teams that play USC.
Yeah, but USC is not blowing out like good teams. They're blowing out, the Arizona States and Colorados and Stanfords of the world, but they're not going to blow out. Obviously, they're not blowing out Utah, I don't think. I think Washington's offense is too good for them to get blown out, and I think Oregon's too good a team to blow out. Like a blowout in any of those matchups would be pretty surprising, but it would also be a statement, big statement.
I mean, I don't know. The hardest way to figure this out, and I know it's like, oh, whatever, no need to figure it out right now because it's almost July.
Yeah, it's June. What else are we going to talk about?
I know. Is what's the committee going to think? Because the biggest thing that irritates me is there's like 5 or now 6 or 7 different rules or qualifications that the committee uses, and it's like, don't pick one year and then pick something else to be your qualification the next.
Yeah, but I mean, people love to hate on the system. I think just kind of in generalities and say, oh, it's no good, it's subjective, it's yada yada yada. Which national championship winning team was left out of the playoff unfairly? Like, give me one.
True.
And by the way, anyone listening to or watching this, I am at Smalls_55 if you would like to debate that with me. But there's not a single team that would have won a national championship that deserved to get in, and it had a season that would have done that, including 2022 Alabama, by the way, that did not get into the playoff. That has never happened. Like we have all these debates about like, oh, who should be number 4? It should be this team. It should be that team. It's like most of the time that team, and this is why I think a 12-team playoff is so stupid. Most of the time, the teams you're debating, they're just going to go in there and get housed. Like if you don't have a clearly identifiable number 4 team, then that team or whichever one gets in, they're not beating the number 1. It's just not going to happen. Like if you have to have a debate, then the game is probably not going to be worthwhile. And over 50% of college football playoff semifinal matchups have been blowouts.
Yep. Yeah, it definitely. It's more irritating to me when it's like, okay, like it's after the fact. It's like, okay, well, if you put, Ohio State in against Bama instead of Cincinnati, it's probably a better game. Well, maybe it's a better game, but guess what? Ohio State didn't deserve to get in. That's why they didn't put them in.
Correct. I completely agree. It's that confluence of factors there of has the team had the season that is worthy of them getting into the playoff, number 1, and number 2, are they actually a good enough team to be there? But I think you should most reward the season over, what teams we think are actually the best, like who could give them the best matchup or, all that sort of stuff. The number 1 consideration should be who had the best season, who has the best resume, because that maximizes the importance of the regular season, which has always been college football's strongest trait and why it's such a widely viewed television product.
Now, do you think that like the independents shouldn't exist anymore?
I wouldn't
harp
say
on Notre Dame so much.
It's just Notre Dame, right? Like none of the other independents matter.
Yeah.
Like in the national landscape, they don't matter. So I don't have a problem with them existing. But Notre Dame,
not existing, but like my biggest harp is Notre Dame needs to go join a conference, because I always get a chuckle out of reading the ESPN banner and it basically says that Notre Dame lost. I said, okay, bye-bye to your playoff chances, because being an independent, Notre Dame has to go undefeated.
But it depends. Not necessarily, no. Depends on what their schedule is.
True.
Like you are not always automatically what your record says you are. And context of who you have played and the quality of opponents you've played 100% matters. So I say that for Notre Dame, if they can get into the playoff, I definitely don't think they'll join a conference anytime soon now that it's going to 12 teams. Because I think the calculation for them would have come down to, do we need a conference championship game to bolster our resume, to solidify, our berth of getting in without having to be undefeated in the regular season? Because when you're sitting there at 11-1, right? Like Ohio State got in this past year to the college football playoff, right? And they clearly deserve to be there because they almost beat Georgia, and they gave Georgia probably the best game of the year outside of randomly Missouri. So I think that when you look at what happened to make that happen, USC had to lose. Remember? USC was number 4 in the college football playoff rankings, playing in the Pac-12 championship game. Win, and they were in. And Ohio State was not going to be in. And so that position of needing help from others is where Notre Dame is year in and year out. Now, when you introduce a 12-team playoff, you remove that sense of urgency to join a conference to say, hey, do we need that game to bolster our resume to get into the college football playoff every year? Because Notre Dame now can just say, well, it's a 12-team playoff. Like if we go 10-2 or 11-1, we're Notre Dame. We're getting into the playoff. Doesn't mean they can win a national championship, but if the goal is to just get into the playoff, which is again a stupid way that people frame the argument, like, oh well, at least we'll be able to get into the playoff. Congratulations. Like Oregon fans sometimes will say, dude, why are you so anti-12 team expansion? Oregon will get into the playoff. Whoop-de-freaking do. Like, we don't have a better team because we're like last year's team was not good enough to win a national championship. Their ceiling was getting to the playoff. But guess what? If they'd gotten into the playoff, you know who they would have played? Georgia. And guess what? I watched that one play out. It wasn't close. It was not even. It was not even close. So
Now I know with that side of things, people debated back and forth like, okay, with if Oregon would have been able to get in somehow and play Georgia again, based on everything that happened after the Georgia game, a lot of people were saying it would have been a lot closer. Now,
yes, I feel
Georgia still would
confident
have
saying it would
won.
have been closer than 49-3. But guess what? That line was going to be set probably around that 17.5 number again that it closed at last year before the game in week 1. Like, it just, Oregon was not good enough to win a national championship a year ago. I don't know if that's a hot take, but that is the correct take. One that I had throughout the course of the season, and again got pushed back on. But sometimes you get pushed back, and then when you end up being right, you get to go on and be like, "Hey, I tried to tell you." It's not that big of a deal and such, but also it's fun being right. But anyway, so I just look at the 12-team playoff, and people are like, "Oh no, it'll create more parity." I'm like, "Bullshit! It will create more parity." Are you kidding me? The best teams are
Oh,
still gonna win.
yeah.
Like, in what universe? This is where I always laugh at the 12-team playoff homers. Who are like, it's going to create more parity because a G5 will get in every year. Like, oh my god, spare me, spare
Yeah,
me,
a group of
spare.
5 team will get in every year just to be slaughtered, most
Yeah,
likely
they'll get
by a
in. They
powerful.
might be able to win a big bowl game. It's not as if G5 teams can't beat Power 5 teams, but G5 teams cannot beat national championship caliber teams.
Yeah,
That is not a thing that happens right now. But it doesn't mean that playing in those big time games doesn't have value, right? It's part of how Cincinnati got an invite to the Big 12. Now they're going to get more money. Now they've got a bigger brand. Now they can recruit better players and whatnot and attract a higher caliber of coaches and not have their coaches get poached the way that Luke Fickell did over to Wisconsin in the Big 10. So I just laugh at this notion when people are like, oh man, you got to have 12 teams in there to make parity. I'm like, okay, I want you to go back and look at every final, like, college football playoff rankings before they play the semifinal in the national championship game, right? Like a season ago. The top 4 were Georgia, Ohio State, TCU, and Michigan. And just on the outside were USC and Notre Dame and God, who else was up there? It feels like it was so long ago. Hold on. But like the point that I'm making here is
yeah,
in what iteration of the 4-team playoff, you had like Kansas State was up there, Tennessee was up there, Penn State was up there, Washington, Tulane, good teams, good football teams. Not trying to argue that. Which one of those was upsetting Georgia? Exactly. Like that was not going to happen. And every year when you go back and look at who won the national championship, you cannot find me a team outside of the top 4. You could maybe go to the top 5 or 6, maybe like 1 or 2 years, and find me a team that could pull an upset of the number 1 or number 2 teams. But by the end of the season, when I watch the games and we watch the season play out, I know full well who the best teams are. And I know that there is a gap, and the cream always rises to the top. And by the way, I'm supportive of a 4-team model because I think you can have years where the 4 can beat the 1. The first iteration of the playoff, Ohio State beat Alabama because guess what? Ohio State deserved to be in that position, and they were good enough to do that. And Oregon beat Florida State, who was undefeated at the time. That's why I think a 4-team playoff is good. If you want to go to 6, fine. 6 is fine. Anything beyond 6 is completely and utterly unnecessary.
I think 8 would be okay. I think 12 is
No, but then you don't. But see, the problem with 8 is you want to have the maximum amount of urgency on the regular season. And if you went to
yeah,
6, then you could have that incentive for teams to keep playing late in the year. They have 2 buys that they'd be playing for, and I think that's valuable to a lot of teams. But when you take that out and you just let 12 teams in, it's like you think the number 12 team is shaking up the playoff picture? Because I got news for you, that's not happening. That's
just for the first round, maybe. But
yeah,
after
exactly.
that,
Like the first, like I don't think everything about a 12-team playoff is not fun. You add more excitement to these big time bowl games, right? The New Year's Six bowls become all exciting games like that. Okay, I'm on. I think that's good, But do the positives outweigh the negatives for me? No, I do not share that particular opinion. But anyway, I got to bounce.
So
I got a dinner to get to. So if you have a final question you wanted to ask, then by all means, fire away.
yeah, sorry about that.
No,
So
you're
my
fine.
my biggest thing is like, okay, for example, let's use the 23 schedule with the 12 team format. Okay, you're gonna play USC for once, and then if you somehow run the table, make the Pac-12 title, you could play them again. So that's twice in a year. And then if you both are ranked properly, that you both make the playoffs, there's a potential you could play 3 times, or put Washington or Utah in there. Play them 3 times. Do you feel like it takes away from the meaningness of the game, or like the rivalry?
To play a team twice?
Basically more than once.
No, I don't think so. Because when you get to the Pac-12 championship game, I mean, look at the Utah USC game a year ago, right? USC was pissed about what happened in Salt Lake City because they thought the officials screwed them. Which, like, hilarious notion that the officials would be screwing the game or rigging the game in favor of the team playing USC. Like first of all, that's not a thing. Like, officials make bad calls. That's what happened there. The Pac-12 is not out to get USC. The Pac-12 wants to put USC on television as much as possible. Like that's a ridiculous notion, number one. But number two, when you have a second matchup, then Caleb Williams comes out and he writes F Utah on his nails. And then that creates more interest and intrigue and hype in the game. And I mean, I think that sort of stuff can be fun. Getting out for a team going out for revenge, or a team completing a season sweep. Like, it's a bummer that USC and UCLA are leaving for a lot of reasons, but one of them is there was a real rivalry starting to brew because of that second matchup between Utah and USC, and they play every year. So if USC had stuck around, that would have been even more must-see television year in and year out. So no, I don't think it takes away from it at all. I think it can actually, enhance the matchups and the back and forth and whatnot, and the X's and O's that coaches deal with there. Like, that's, I think, all really, really fun and whatnot to watch. So no, I think that's totally fine.
All right. Well, I don't know if we completely accomplished what maybe people want, but everybody leave your comments down below on your thoughts for the upcoming season for the Ducks. I want to thank Spencer for joining me today. Maybe, depending on how things go, maybe we'll have him back, just based on schedules and whatnot. But thanks again, everybody, and I hope you tune in again.